How do you dismantle an industrial economy while an invading army is closing in, then make it produce again? The Soviet Union did it by sending machine tools, skilled workers, drawings, and unfinished production east by rail, then attaching them to an industrial base that already existed beyond the immediate German advance. It was not a clean transfer. Output collapsed, equipment was scattered, and people worked through hunger, cold, crowding, and coercion. The evacuation saved productive capacity by turning distance into time, then making workers pay much of the cost of that time. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on 22 June 1941. 2 days later, the Soviet government created a council for evacuation. The speed sounds like proof of a finished master plan. It was almost the opposite. Historian Mark Harrison describes the crash program as improvised under leaders with extraordinary authority. The state had institutions built for command and mobilization, but no calm way to move an economy while the front was collapsing. The first problem was triage. A factory was too large to move as one object, and there were never enough railcars, cranes, or days. Managers had to decide what made the factory reproducible. The valuable core was not its walls. It was machine tools, dies, gauges, drawings, partly finished components, and the people who knew how the production line actually behaved. Heavy machines had to be disconnected, marked, lifted, loaded, and sent toward destinations that sometimes changed while trains were moving. A missing jig or transformer could leave an otherwise complete workshop unable to produce. Disassembly itself was a form of industrial knowledge. Connections had to be labeled so a different crew could understand them hundreds of miles away. Precision surfaces had to survive lifting and weather. The workers who knew a machine's habits were often as important as the machine. A drawing could specify a tolerance. It could not always explain the vibration, worn bearing, or improvised adjustment that kept one line within it. So the evacuation was not one eastbound convoy. It was thousands of urgent decisions competing for the same railway. Troops and weapons moved toward the front. Wounded soldiers and civilians moved away from it. Coal, food, fuel, and industrial equipment all needed the same tracks. The railway did not make the crisis disappear. It compressed the choices. The map also hides an important fact. The Soviet Union did not begin building industry east of the Ural Mountains in 1941. During the industrial drives of the 1930s, the state had already developed coal, steel engineering, power, and defense capacity in the Volga region, the Urals, Western Siberia, and Central Asia. Evacuated workshops could be bolted onto existing plants, unfinished sites, or new halls near rail and power. That eastern base was the difference between moving machinery and merely storing it. It also means that relocated factories did not always reappear as exact copies of themselves. Equipment could reinforce an existing enterprise, occupy an unfinished site, or become part of a new combined plant. Historians still produce different totals because they may count a legal enterprise, a physical workshop, or a set of machines sent to several destinations. The clean number usually quoted is less useful than the process. Productive pieces were redistributed into places that could connect them to rail, power, metal, and management. But arrival was only the start. A machine tool unloaded beside a railway siding was not production. It needed a floor that would hold alignment, electric power, belts or motors, measuring equipment, raw material, and workers who could operate it. Some plants began under roofs that were still being built. Others installed equipment in the open while winter approached. A November 1941 order to Factory No. 34 in Chelyabinsk demanded faster restoration of evacuated chemical production. The surviving document captures the real problem. The state could issue priority, but people still had to turn crates and disconnected machines into a working line. Restart times varied enormously. Harrison gives one striking example. The Kharkov tractor factory was evacuated in October 1941 and delivered tanks again after 7 weeks. That is the version most often remembered. The less cinematic fact matters just as much. Some factories moved in 1941 were still idle at the end of 1942 because there were no workers to run them. A successful train journey did not guarantee a successful factory. And workers were not interchangeable cargo. Specialists were selected because they carried knowledge that drawings could not fully preserve. Factory employees and key engineers were directed east with their enterprises. Some families followed, others were separated. An evacuation certificate from 1941 records one person sent from Podolsk to Tashkent. It looks like a small piece of paper, because that is what an enormous state movement became at human scale. A name, a destination, and permission to leave one life for another. Across the wider evacuation, millions of civilians also fled or were transported east. Their experience did not fit a simple line between volunteer and deportee. Historian Rebecca Manley describes the Soviet evacuee as occupying an unstable position between refugee and person moved by state command. Priority went first to war production and the workers considered essential to it. Safety was real, but choice was often narrow. At the destination, accommodation was one of the worst bottlenecks. The The regions receiving factories were short of transport, electricity, food, clothing, and housing before the new arrivals appeared. People crowded into dormitories, schools, barracks, and rooms shared with local families. Some slept inside factory space or in temporary shelters. The same state that demanded immediate production often could not provide the minimum conditions needed to sustain it. Labor discipline added another edge. Wartime rules tied many workers to their jobs and threatened punishment for absence or unauthorized departure. Archival research by Martin Krag shows that coercive law was a central priority, even when enforcement was uneven and managers still struggled to keep labor. The effort was not powered by terror alone. Skill, commitment, patriotism, wages, food access, and the need to survive all mattered. But it would be false to describe the work as a voluntary national relay. Coercion could order a person to appear. It could not create precision, replace calories, or repair a missing tool. Plant managers therefore had to enforce discipline while also competing for rations, housing, skilled hands, and time. That contradiction helps explain why the same system could restart one complex plant in weeks and leave another silent for more than a year. Women and teenagers filled industrial jobs as men entered the armed forces. Prisoners and other compelled labor also supported parts of the wartime economy. These groups did not experience the same conditions. And they should not be collapsed into one heroic worker. What connected them was a system that placed weapons output above almost every civilian claim. That priority produced a dangerous paradox. The relocated defense factories needed steel, fuel, electricity, components, food, and healthy labor. Yet the mobilization that supplied the army stripped the civilian economy of those same resources. Harrison writes that steel, fuel, power, and food output plunged while the population starved and equipment wore out. A tank plant could be open and still stop because its workers were hungry or a supplier had vanished. The relocation succeeded then, not because every factory moved intact, and not because central planning erased friction. It succeeded because the state could rank a narrow set of things above nearly everything else. Save critical tools, preserve scarce skills, control rail capacity. Concentrate resources in the East, and accept immense disruption elsewhere. By 1942, factories beyond the immediate German advance were again increasing the flow of tanks, aircraft, guns, and ammunition. Archive photographs show repaired tanks and production lines in the Urals. They are evidence of recovery, but not proof of a painless miracle. Behind every finished vehicle stood machines that arrived out of sequence, local plants forced to absorb strangers, and families living where cities had not caught up with factories. So how did the Soviet Union move its industry beyond Hitler's reach? It did not move a finished economy. It broke production into the parts that could survive a train journey, carried machines and knowledge east, joined them to an industrial base built before the war, and forced a restart under extreme shortage. What crossed the rails was not a factory already running. It was the chance to build one again. The distance saved the machines. The people made them work.